I don't know if we can ever predict all the different ways and all the different people who are going to be trying to hack into our systems.
Welcome to the LabVIEW Experiment. I am your host, Sam Taggart from SAS Workshops. In my 15 years of working with and training developers, I've had the opportunity to conduct a lot of experiments. Over here, we believe in embracing failure as the essential learning experience that it is. And what better way to learn than from other people's mistakes? In this podcast, I talk to industry experts, colleagues, and friends about their failures and how they have turned them into future successes. I am here today with Steve Summers from NI, and I most recently got to know Steve through his work on security. So you want to start talking about that a little bit, and then maybe we can get into some other stuff?
Sure. Do you want to talk about how I got into what we're doing, maybe?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So I've been with NI for, a long time, 27 years. So I started in 1997. And I was did the whole application engineer thing, and then I went into sales. I was in sales for a long time, so I was in Wisconsin for a little bit, Utah for a little bit, and then I was in Seattle for quite a while, and covered the Northwest. And then I actually left NI and went to another company that makes small cameras for doing production line inspection of like LCD displays and things. And then about a year later, one of my friends at NI called me and said, "Come back." And I said, I'm not really wanting to go back to NI. There's a few things that I just don't think that NI is doing right. And she said, "Well, come back and work with me and help me fix that stuff." And I thought that sounded like that would be pretty interesting to do. And so I came back and joined her group and actually worked on her group, which was doing the LabVIEW marketing, and I was on the team that was working on LabVIEW NXG. So that was an interesting part of that history. But then worked on the LabVIEW NXG stuff. But I wasn't really working on NXG. I was working on kind of the side part of that, which was our enterprise agreements, volume license agreements, and customer education. All of that was kind of that part. So kind of focused on what we were calling customer success at the time. And I did that for a few years. And then in 2019, came over and joined our group that is doing aerospace and defense. And as I came to that team, I started noticing that everybody had kind of their focus areas, but nobody was working on what I thought was one of the biggest concerns, which was security. So I talked to my manager and said, "Hey, I'd like to take on the security challenge and try to figure that out from a representing our customer and our industry perspective." And so he asked me to dive into that. And now I spend probably half to 60% of my time working on the security parts of what we do at NI, and just encouraging our R&D teams to do the right things and teaching them what the right things are, talking to our customers to understand from them what the requirements they're seeing, and trying to create materials that will be helpful to our customers for security. So that's kind of how I got into the security thing. So again, today it's like half of what I do. And then the other half is that I manage our mechanical systems testing. So if you're testing strain gauge stuff or airplanes that are moving and shaking or making noise, then I'm also working on that part of it.
Okay. Now, the security thing, is that being driven by changes in regulation, or is it just more security consciousness in general, or both? Or
It's kind of both. I think it's primarily the changes in regulation, because we're seeing a bunch of changes happen across different industries right now, and that I think raises generally the awareness. And so companies that even aren't affected by the regulations are now more aware of it and are more concerned about it. Certainly, the number of attacks and the number of hacks that have happened over the last 5-10 years have made people more conscious of security. I just got a notice over the weekend that one of my doctor's offices has been hacked, and so my information has been stolen. And so it's one thing when it's your customers and it's their their health information, but it's another thing when it's defense secrets and those are being stolen and hacked into. So our customers at all levels are, whether they are a doctor's office or whether they are a huge a defense contractor, they're all being forced into thinking about security and trying to protect the data that they have a lot more than they were 10 years ago.
so it's not just defense then.
No, certainly not. So it's interesting I'm focused on aerospace and defense because that's my group, but I meet a lot with semiconductor companies and with transportation companies. So you look at like a car, right? Cars are increasingly smart, and they have all these computer systems on them, and there's a number of ways that you can hack into those systems. And so we're finding that our customers that are building cars, building trucks, they are just as concerned about security as the ones that are making missiles and rockets and airplanes.
Yeah, I remember seeing probably like 5 years ago now, somebody got into a Jeep and hacked it and drove it around. Do you remember that?
Yeah,
Yeah, that was
yeah,
a story. Yeah, it's on YouTube. I'm sure people can go look.
yeah. One of the stories that I point back to, it happened actually 10 years ago. So it's like 2014. And that year, there was a big, the big Christmas gift that you could get your parents and stuff was one of those computerized picture frames. And those were kind of cool. I got one for my mom, right? So I could give her this picture frame, and then I could send her pictures. I could email pictures to this picture frame, and they would show up on the picture frame, and I didn't have to keep like sending her actual printed pictures and stuff. And that was a cool picture, and or I mean, a cool gift. Well, it turned out that a number of those that you purchased that year had a virus on them. That once you put that on your network, it started crawling across the network and looking for other target machines. So I gave it to my mom, right? And then would go across the network and find her machine, and then it would start renaming and deleting files on her machine, and that was a virus. And as people started looking at where did that virus come from, it was actually installed because the test machine at the end of the production line over in China had a virus on it, and it was installing that onto the picture frames as they were going out the door. So if you bought that frame from that production line that year, you got that virus. And that
Yeah,
was just a picture frame.
yeah. Yeah, that sounds rather benign compared to what it could get up to, just deleting files. Because I remember like the start of computer security stuff, a lot of the hacks were just like people screwing around and like trying to
Yeah.
they could if this would work and like, posting funny messages and stuff like that. But it's gotten a lot worse over the years. Uh,
Yeah, it's certainly turned into like an actual industry now, right? And there are professional hackers and they make a lot of money. So today they wouldn't delete the file on my mom's computer. They would pop up a message to her that told her that if they would grab control of her computer, and then they would tell her, if you have to go down and buy gift cards and give us this money, or else we're going to lock your computer or give your information to somebody, or they'd be mining her banking information and those kinds of things off the backside of it. And it's a multi-billion-dollar industry right now that people are stealing money from those of us that click on a link somewhere.
yeah. So in the LabVIEW world, maybe I know I've seen this change over the years. When I first started, we would have like CEOs and stuff, and the argument was always like, oh, it's behind our firewall. We don't have to worry about it. And I feel like, I mean, I thought that was a bad argument way back then, but I feel like now
Yeah.
it's an even worse argument.
Yeah, the number of customers that were able to say, "Well, it's air gapped," was really big. And I was in sales, and I had a lot of customers that bought PXI because it said PXI, because it didn't say computer. They wanted to make sure it doesn't say computer on the quote, right? Because if it says computer, then it flags my security group. But if it doesn't say computer, I can put it on the line and I can own it as if it's a non-computer, even though it's running Windows and doing all that stuff. And and their justification was it's air gapped. I'm going to put it on. It's not connected to anything. And the problem with that is that it's not secure. So, the really big event that happened was Stuxnet that happened. Oh, man, has that been 20 years now? It's been a long time. And if you remember that one, that was in Iran, and they were trying to process uranium, and their those systems got a virus on them that made the PLCs it offset their measurements a little bit. So as they were trying to control these gyroscopes um, and do some work with those PLCs, it would change the measurement just enough that they couldn't effectively process the uranium, and it set them back a few years as they were trying to figure out what was going on. And so depending what side of that issue you're on, you either won or lost because of that virus. But the thing about Stuxnet is those PLCs, those were air gapped.
Yep.
And they were air gapped, but they were, somebody picked up a USB stick or something in the parking lot and plugged it into that system, and the virus got onto the network on that controlled network, and it did its thing. And people are worried that that's what will happen to us, right? If you have an air gap system, there's still so many ways to get onto that system.
And that virus actually was very insidious because it only changed things slightly and it did a really good job of covering its tracks. If it hadn't gotten loose everywhere, we might have never even heard about it.
Yeah,
'Cause
it was
I read a little bit
very
about that.
professional.
Yeah, they intentionally did not want the Iranians to know that they were hacked because then they would just stop ordering the stuff. But they
Right.
messed it up just enough that they would keep trying and thinking, oh, there's a problem with the machine.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
very insidious.
Yeah.
So the question I have is like, is there like a set of tips or tricks or common mistakes that people make with NI products when it comes to security that we could go over?
Yeah, certainly. I actually think the biggest mistake we make is in trying to distance ourselves from the security people, right? The security people come to us and they'll tell us, "Hey, your system needs to not allow USB sticks to run," and we'll go, "Well, why?" And so then they'll contact us and say, "How do you disable the USB ports on a PXI controller?" Um, but if we knew what was causing that question, then we could figure out other ways to resolve that concern that still work with our test system. And so the biggest mistake that we make is just not bringing them in and talking to the security team. Most security teams have no idea what our testers are doing, what the test team does. So when we take them and walk them around the floor and we show them, look, this is a strain gauge system and this is testing, and this test runs for 6 months. And while it's testing, it's doing all this stuff. And if you reboot in the middle of one of those tests, this huge weight is going to fall and kill somebody, right? And that's something that most security teams have never actually experienced and seen because they're IT guys and they sit in a room somewhere. But if you can get them down and you can walk them through, and then if they can show you these are the security requirements that we have to meet, the regulations that we fall under, then when they give you the requirement and say no USB sticks, you can say why? What is the reasoning behind that? Because I use USB and it's critical to what I'm doing. Then you can talk to them about it. You can see that the control that they're trying to meet doesn't say no USB. What it says is you have to control your USB connections. And then you can look at that and say, let's figure out how we can approach that problem. And so having that relationship with the security team, I think, is something we overlook and skip a lot. I've seen a few companies do it well, but most companies they really don't have that relationship.
Yeah, when I worked at Westinghouse, we used to call the IT department the no department because we'd ask them to go do
Yeah,
something. No, you can't do that. And that was the end of the conversation. And I
because
always
their
felt
life's a lot easier if they just say no. They don't have to
Yeah, and I
figure out
always
how.
felt like it would be better if we could work together and just be like, okay, you want to transfer files from here to here. That's why you want the USB key. Hey, here's a way to do it securely that works and then meets our security requirements. And you can, that's a conversation that needs to happen. But too often it's either you ask and you get told no, or you just decide not to ask and you figure out a way around it anyway, which
Right.
gets you in more trouble.
Yeah.
You get
Yeah.
more security holes.
Yeah, and so you working around what they're trying to set up just slows you down and opens up those security gaps. And so I think that's the main thing is that once you understand that, then there's a lot of other things that we can certainly do. And we can talk about all the different areas, as we go through this today. But there's a lot of little tips and tricks that you can do. I don't want to call them tricks necessarily. There's approaches you can take. But the first step, I think, is that communication.
Yeah. So does the security paradigm change when you move from like running, say, a LabVIEW application on a desktop to running on a Creo or a PXI chassis?
Yeah, I think the main thing that changes in those is the the workflow, the expected workflow, right? Because on a laptop, you are typically logging in and you're doing some stuff, and then you're logging out and leaving the system, right? So if you're developing LabVIEW, for example, if I'm developing LabVIEW code, I'll come in and I'll log in and I'll use my profile to log into the computer. I'll develop it for a couple of hours, and then I'll shut it down and go to lunch. When you move to a deployed system like a compact Rio system or let's say a PXI system running real time, and it's running your application now, it's going to run all the time, and it may not allow you to log in and log out as a user. So now I'm not using the Windows system to track who the user is. And so now in that deployed um, workflow, as opposed to the development workflow, I've got to have a different security strategy that I have to think through more carefully as I'm developing the application.
Yeah, I noticed that when I worked at Westinghouse, we worked on the systems that went into nuclear power plants, and it was actually kind of
Yeah.
strange because uh, this was before security was a really big deal, and so I had access to the machines that were going into the plant, and I could install whatever I wanted. But it was funny that on my own laptop, I couldn't install, like I could build the
Yeah,
software on my laptop. I could install it on the thing that was going into the plant, but I couldn't run it on my own machine because the IT policy somehow got in the way of that.
yeah.
I had to
And if
click.
they had their way, they would have blocked everything. But
Oh,
they didn't know about those because you'd call this a C-RIO, and they're like, okay, well, C-RIO is not a computer, so I guess we don't have control of that.
yeah, that was the other thing, and I've seen this a lot actually too. People have their own separate router or something. They're like that
Hmm.
isolates their lab, and oh, it's on the lab network, so it's not on the whole exposed to the whole uh, office or whatever. And
Yeah.
there's
And I've done
definitely
that too, where I put a little router in my desk. I'm like, I don't want to use the company network. And so I put a little thing, and then my wireless was better and all that stuff. But the number of security gaps that you open up that they're trying to plug all the time. And then you get engineers who are like, well, I can solve this myself. That it causes problems.
yeah, there was some big hack recently, and maybe it was LastPass or something, but the guy had some sort of he was at home running some multimedia Plex server or something, and it got
Hmm.
hacked, and they got onto his computer, and then got his credentials, and then got into the company, and so
Yeah. I don't know. I know that LastPass had a hack. I don't know if that's how that happened, but there's a lot of stories about that. There are a couple of really interesting podcasts where one of them I listen to is called Darknet Diaries.
yeah, that's a great show. Yeah, I love that
You
show.
listen to that too? Yeah, he's got a lot of great stories on there. And guys come on that were hackers, and they'll tell you about, this is how I got into it, or this is how I hacked. And
Mhm.
you listen to that, and you're like, oh my gosh, he could have gotten me because I totally open up that way.
Yeah.
And so it's been very informative to learn about some of these strategies people use.
Yeah, the other one that I like is Security Now is a good one with Steve Gibson.
Oh, I haven't heard that one.
Yeah,
So I'll have to
it's
look
more
that
of
one up.
like a current events news type thing, but it really gets into, and he gets into some of the details, particularly in the earlier episodes. He gets into like how all the different hacks work and things, and it's very good. Yeah, the Dark Knight Diaries is a much more exciting podcast. It's got lots of
Yeah,
interesting stories. He's a good storyteller.
yeah, that's a fun one.
Yeah, I like the social engineering stuff because like we think that most hacks are like these super technical things, and in reality, like sometimes it is like if you're going against the NSA or the Chinese or whatever, yeah, sure. But even then, like the human element is so important to just like all it takes is one person clicking on a link in an email and like that's it.
Yeah. Yeah, and there was one a couple of weeks ago. He was interviewing somebody, and they were talking about that. And one of a professional FBI guy who spends his days hunting down hackers himself got tricked in social media and lost $100,000 to somebody like that because they're really good at what they do.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
on a LabVIEW system, we think, well, there's no social media there, but there kind of is because they can get into our systems that same way, right? You get an email from somebody that looks like your coworker and he's asking you to do something. So the only way that IT has really figured out how to combat that social approach is to is what they call zero trust, right? Where they'll say, let's not trust anybody anywhere. And the model we use to kind of describe that is the airport, right? So once you get into the airport, you go up to the desk and you check in, and they check your ID. Then you go to TSA and they check your ID again, and then you get to the gate and they check for your pass again there before you get on the plane. And so there's multiple points where you have to prove I should be here. And it's that same way in a good secure network system is the same way where you can't assume, well, if they're in the building, it's safe. So my air gap system is okay. Or if they're on the network, somebody else figured out that they should be there. So you have to put up checks at every spot to say, I don't trust anybody coming onto the system. I don't trust anybody logging in. I don't trust any network systems. I don't trust anything. So every spot, I'm rechecking the credentials to make sure that who is getting in should be getting in.
Yeah. No, that's definitely been a huge change in the industry. Like I
Yeah.
said, people used to just throw it behind a firewall and say, "Oh, it's behind a firewall."
Yeah,
But
and
else,
really for LabVIEW, that means we're moving from zero security to zero trust, and
yeah.
it's a pretty big change, right? Because I mean, most LabVIEW systems, we never, in all the 27 years that we have worked here, security was never the priority when any of us developed a LabVIEW system. Most of my customers never asked about security, and our developers weren't prioritizing security as the main way, the main feature of LabVIEW. It was more about ease of use and performance.
Mhm.
And now, the last few years, as security has become front and center, we've all had to pivot and change and say, "Whoa! Now, how am I going to make my LabVIEW system secure? And how is the LabVIEW team? What are we doing to make LabVIEW secure?"
Now, is a lot of the security focus, is it more around? access control, or is it also about like low level stuff like, buffer overflows and those type of concerns?
It really is both. Um, it depends on who you're trying to talk to, right? So technical guys talking to technical guys will always talk about the low level things like is it encrypted and the buffer overflows and securing your code that way so that people can't hack into it and securing against like SQL calls. Um, if you're talking to the guys who are checking the boxes, the IT guys, the security team, then they're looking at what do the requirements call out. And the requirements call out, like if you look at NIST 800-171, which is the main document we use for security, there's 110 controls in that document. And the first 22 of them, which is a full 1/5 of those, are all access control. What are you doing to make sure that they're, who's here, who's logged in, how are you tracking those people who are logged in? Do you kick them off when they're not active anymore? 22 controls are all about that stuff, not about the technical details. And then the technical details are kind of wrapped up into just a couple of requirements where they say, oh, make sure you scan your code to look for any technical details.
Okay. Yeah, I know we had talked, speaking of scanning code, we had talked a little bit at one point. You were working on a set of VI analyzer tools to
Yeah.
detect certain things. And I remember it being somewhat difficult because, like, the classic SQL injection, right? If you take code from your customer and you allow them to enter a string and you put it into a database query, well, they can do pretty much anything they want if you're not extra careful with that. But by the same token, like if you control the string and it's picked from a list box or something, yeah, you're still sending a string in, but you have control over it, and so in theory, it's less vulnerable. But
Yeah,
it's hard to tell that from
it's
the inspection without like digging into it.
yeah, it's complicated. And it starts with trying to figure out like if you are going to scan your code to look for something that's not secure, then what would you scan for? And we can kind of put our heads together and think, well, buffer overflows and SQL calls and those kinds of things. But
What do those look like?
it seems like there should be a more professional way to get to there, and there is, right? So there's a CWE database, these common weakness enumerations. So you can go to this database of the most commonly reported hacks and how they got in and what are the biggest concerns. And they list hundreds or thousands of these attacks that people get in with. And then they boil those down to the top weaknesses.
Mhm.
And so most customers, if you can just address like the top 20 weaknesses, you're doing pretty good. And so if you look at those top 20 weaknesses, the number one is buffer overflow, right? Where the most common way that people will hack into a software system, like a web page, is that they will give it a text string for whatever entry field that's so long that it breaks the code and the code crashes. And then while it's in this crashed state, you can get in and do all kinds of stuff. So that's a really simple way of hacking code. Well, all you have to do to protect that is just put some parameters around it to say, hey, if the entry is too long, ignore it, right? Instead of
Yeah.
like crashing to it. And buffer overflows, putting in numbers that are too big and those kinds of things. It's pretty easy to guard against those things, but that's the number one weakness in software. And then out of the top 10, the next three or four are going to be those SQL calls where they're asking you for your username. And instead of your username, you put in an SQL call that says like delete the SQL database, right? And so you put
Yeah.
that call in there and it does all this damage. Again, easy to fix. All you have to do is check any field that comes in and say, if there's an SQL call, strip it out and don't allow it. Um, so you can go and get those, but now how would you scan for that in any code, right? Because any code is going to have how do you scan to say, does this number, will it overflow? It's a pretty difficult thing to scan for because there's so many different ways of using numbers and using other things. And so, and then to complicate that, LabVIEW actually does most of that for you, right? So it's really difficult to create an overflow situation in LabVIEW because we manage the memory for you most of the time, unless you do something very specific in your LabVIEW code. So we can look for those LabVIEW things, and really the way that what that kind of looks like is we have to go and look at those top weaknesses and interpret those into LabVIEW because they're different than they are in the C world or the Python world. And so, yeah, we looked at trying to how do you build that with something like VI Analyzer? How do you create a scanner that and tune VI Analyzer to go and scan that? And there's been a little bit of work done in that along that area, but the thing that we quickly realized was that to do that, you don't have to be a LabVIEW expert as much as you have to be a security expert. And then you have to continually keep that updated and keep updating it all the time. So it's a pretty big commitment to release a toolkit like that that's going to be continuously doing that kind of scanning and updating that so that it stays up to date. And so as we've tried to figure out what we're going to do, JKI has a developer that kind of jumped into that and said, well, I can take that on. And so Hunter Smith has done a great job of creating a scanning tool that is tuned to those security things. And he's gone through the CWE databases and a couple of other resources that are available to look for the top things he should be looking for in LabVIEW code. He's done a great job with that. And it works very well with CI/CD servers and continuous build. So he's done an excellent job. And he's got such a good solution. I don't think that it would be really valuable at all for us to create something out of VI Analyzer, because anything we did would, number one, just compete with work he's already done. But he's already done. It wouldn't be any better than what he's done. And I think we'd have a hard time keeping up with what he's been able to build already.
Yeah, and I think no matter what, it would end up having to be a paid for product anyway. I don't think.
Yeah, it's going to have to be just because the cost. If you look at what's available for text-based tools, um, there's things from Fortify, and there's other text-based things, and some of them are lower cost, but they're lower cost because they're not continuously staffed. So the ones that are really good are actually pretty expensive too. And so that was another concern we had, is how do we do that at a good cost? Now, just recently, there was one of our other LabVIEW users, and out of RAM Aerospace, and he created a bunch of open source tools, and we referenced that on our security site. He created a bunch of open source tools for security, and along with that, he created a simplified scanner. And so we will go through and do some pretty simple scanning, and I think those are kind of the two approaches that are available today, and they're actually pretty good options. One of them is free, and something that is open source, so you can tune that to look for the things that you think your organization needs to look for. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you have the JKI tools, which are looking for the common established things that are really good, but it's going to cost you some money to get that. And you've kind of got that spectrum of options now.
Well, I think that's good though, because security is kind of a gradient, right? You're never
It
like
is.
100% secure, right? And so, do you need to be 100% secure? If you're doing mil-aero stuff, yeah, that's probably a big deal. If you're, doing
Mhm.
something, I don't know, testing rock climbing gears, for example,
Or picture frames,
or picture frames, yeah,
right?
yeah, picture frames are even better. Yeah, rock climbing people could die. Picture frames probably not going to kill anybody.
Yeah, you just want to make sure that you've met the basic security. And so what's interesting is that, you know, um, yeah, there's this spectrum, and in the U.S., the only regulation that we really see is around the defense stuff. And so the government saying, if you're going to sell something to the government, we're going to drive it from that perspective. But as a regular everyday consumer, there's nothing that protects me when I go buy a picture frame,
Yep.
other than just like the free market and trying to, how America is.
Yeah, that's a poor
Um,
argument though, because like the end consumer has no way to judge the security status of like the picture frame, right? That's
yeah, that's a tough
We're
one.
not informed consumers, and they just say, "Oh, it's like you see things advertised. It's like, oh, uses triple grade military encryption." You're like, well, what the heck does that mean?
Yeah,
Right?
I
And
was I
it
was talking to somebody this
means
morning, in
different.
fact, and he said he was looking at we were looking at a piece of software together, and he said, "Oh, it says on here this is military grade encryption." And he says, "Why do people say that?" He was in the military. He just retired 3 years
Yeah,
ago, and we were talking about this, and he says, "Why do they say military grade? Because military grade sucks. Military
yeah.
stuff falls apart all the time."
Well, there's also though too, like, right? Okay, it's encrypted, but how do you manage the keys? And if you don't manage the keys
Yeah,
well, then it doesn't matter.
yeah,
And what's encrypted? Is it encrypted when it's sitting there on the disk? Is it encrypted while it's moving around?
yeah.
Yeah,
So
there's a
you kind of got to so we're trusting companies to be safe. So Europe is taking a different approach right now, and so Europe just this year passed a regulation that they call the Cyber Resilience Act. Have you heard about this CRA thing?
I've heard a tiny bit about it, but why don't you go on?
So the CRA is a set of requirements that says that in order to sell anything into Europe, you have to get this CE mark. Now we have to get a CE mark today for any products we sell into Europe, and they have to meet certain like EMI restrictions, and you have to get them tested basically, and and assert that you meet. these standards that Europe has. Well, this new CE mark will include security standards, and it'll apply to any digital enabled product. So that means software or hardware, and that means that the software or hardware needs to meet a bunch of security requirements that they've laid out. And those requirements include things like encryption. It includes things like no malicious code, and you have to develop with a secure approach, and a pretty good set of things. And basically, we have from now until 2027 to fully comply with that. So, if any of your any of your listeners are making systems that they sell into Europe, they're going to have this fall to them over the next couple of years. If you're going to sell picture frames into Europe, those picture frames have to have this CE mark for security that shows that picture frame has that level of security to it. If you sell smart enabled refrigerators or toasters, if you sell software like LabVIEW, all of that has to have the CE mark. And so we've been looking at those requirements, and a lot of them are good standard things that are pretty easy to meet, but a couple of the requirements are actually going to be pretty tricky for us to meet. It's going to have a pretty big impact on our customers. So like one example is one of the requirements of the CRA says that when you deliver a product, it has to have 0 known exploitable vulnerabilities, right? So today, we ship software, we ship LabVIEW, and LabVIEW is made up of all these components. Got thousands of components that we've gotten from third parties or open source or whatever, and we use those components, and then and every once in a while, quite frequently, there are new announcements come out and they say, hey, this component, this open source component has a vulnerability. And then we have to go back and look at everywhere that we used it inside of LabVIEW, Test Stand, and other products, and we have to update that component so that it doesn't have that vulnerability anymore. Well, sometimes those components have vulnerabilities, but they're not exploitable, right? So maybe we use a component inside of LabVIEW, but the component vulnerability is that if you send it a certain string, it's going to break a certain way. But because we haven't exposed the way that you can get a string into that component inside the bowels of LabVIEw, there's no way that a customer could send any of their own strings. It will only accept the strings that we've pre-programmed into it. So it's not really exploitable. Okay, so but when we ship these products, they have to ship with 0 known exploitable vulnerabilities, and that means that we have to go back and respond to those a lot faster as a company. And we have to look at all the current vulnerabilities and remove all of those exploitable vulnerabilities, remove all of those and make sure that it ships like that. And there could be delays to our European customers if a vulnerability is announced and we go, whoa, we need a little bit of time to refactor that.
I was gonna say, yeah, I wonder how that works. Like if I ship you something today, and then tomorrow somebody announces a vulnerability, and I ship you something the next day, like did I suddenly violate that, right? Because now it's
and that's not clear yet in the CRA. So the CRA is right now, it's a very high like political language, and when you read it, it has these aspirational things like no known exploitable vulnerabilities, but the details of what does that mean on the day we ship, so the day we release, or does that mean the day we ship it from our dock to you, right? Those are two very different dates. And it has big implications like that, because if a vulnerability comes out, do we have to keep starting and stopping our shipment of LabVIEW to our customers? Or can we say this on the day that it shipped had no vulnerabilities, and so we're good for that version?
It feels like there should be like some sort of window in there too, where like, okay, you find out about it, you can still keep shipping it because you got like 30 days to
Yeah.
fix it or something. I don't
Yeah,
know.
see, and that's one of the requirements. That one requirement is very unique to Europe, because the American rules are really more like that. If you hear a vulnerability, you have to respond within a certain number of days, and you have to report it and all this other stuff. Europe just says no vulnerabilities; they don't exist, and that's not attainable. And so, over the next couple of years, we expect to see more things coming out. But in the meantime, what that means for us is that we've had to shift a lot of our new feature development from our LabVIEW teams and other to fixing vulnerabilities, because we've got to be ready so that in 2027 we're shipping product that has no known vulnerabilities in it.
Yeah, that's difficult.
The other requirement that's in the CRA that's interesting is that your product has to install in its most secure configuration. So today, like I can give you like LabVIEW, you can buy LabVIEW, and I can tell you ways that you can make it more secure, like disable the web server, right? in 2027, that product will need to install already in that most secure configuration. And when you bring it down from that by enabling things, we have to give you a warning. So we'll ship it to you, and all of a sudden, LabVIEW Web Server won't work because that's not the most secure configuration. And you'll go in and you'll enable Web Server, and we'll have to give you a little window that says, "Hey, you're enabling Web Server." And just so you know, that opens up some ports that are going to cause some open potential security issues.
Yeah.
And that's going to, I think, scare a lot of customers, but it's also going to make installation a different experience than it is today.
Well, that's not a terribly bad thing, right?
Yeah,
Security default, because like people get like one of the big things is like routers will sometimes ship and they'll ship with like something exposed on the WAN that shouldn't be. And it's
yeah, and
like,
you have to go shut it down.
yeah, and it's the tyranny of the default. Like most people, they don't think to go check all those defaults, particularly like if it's not an option when you're setting it
Yeah,
up, they never think to go look, and then next thing you know, you have a problem.
yeah, and that's exactly what Europe is trying to get ahead of. So I like that they've given us 3 years, so we can start to kind of ease into it. So it's not just an overnight, hey, everybody, it's a different experience. But we can start over the next 3 years as we make releases. We can start easing towards that, so it won't be such a radical change. But you will see 3 years from now that your experience in setting up new hardware or software from NI or from any company is going to be a little bit different as we try to meet that experience or that requirement from Europe.
Yeah. No, to that point though, the point about like routers having stuff exposed, like sometimes like the security is more in the application than the actual code itself, right? So like you write something that's meant to be on a local network and controlled, and like okay, the security level's a little lower, and then all of a sudden you expose it. So even in like lab
Yeah,
use, some of the stuff that we use, file transfer mechanisms or whatever, like if you're doing it on the local network, maybe it requires one level of security, and if you're exposing it on the internet, it probably requires a whole different level.
yeah, for sure. And the US regulations are really good about that at the beginning, saying analyze your system and determine what level of security you really need to meet. Where the European one is more like just meet security. And you know, the security of your refrigerator is going to just be different than the security of a missile launch system, right? It's just going to have to be different. And so I think there's a little bit of definition that's still going to come out from Europe, and we're anxiously waiting for how that's going to develop. But
Yeah, that refrigerator would be very expensive if it had that level. So,
and hard to use if you had to every time you want to open the refrigerator put in a 10-digit pin or something, you know,
yeah.
it's going to be interesting.
So I have a curious question. So I know in like the Python ecosystem and maybe even JavaScript and some of those, there's been a lot of supply chain attacks where
Hmm.
people have tried to inject stuff into like PyPy, the Python package index, or any of that stuff. Have you seen any of that in LabVIEW, or is LabVIEW just obscure enough that nobody's figured that out yet?
That's an interesting question. So we have not seen any attacks into that supply chain targeted at LabVIEW, but we are using components, right? So we use
Ah,
like I said, thousands of those components. And so sometimes we have to, like those attacks that are attacking Python and these other open source communities, and they're trying to get into there. Some of those are components that we do use. Like we use the Apache web server, right? That's an open source web server, and that's the one that we use for the LabVIEW web server. And there have been attacks on the Apache open source community. And so we've had to just make sure that we're not using those versions, and we've had to update versions to keep that secure. So we're constantly monitoring that. And one of the big things that has changed in the last year to get us closer to monitoring that is that because of some US government regulations, we've gone through and created a tooled out our LabVIEW development systems for SBOMs, right? Software bill of material. So in a couple of years ago, when there were some of these major hacks that happened, like uh, the
Log4j, was it?
yeah, Log4j was a good one. So Log4j, when that came out, we had to just manually open up all the code and look for Log4j instances. And we didn't have a really good catalog of what components we were using across all of our software, in the drivers, in LabVIEW, in test stand, and everywhere else. And so we've tooled up so that now, when we created this like in August this year, we created an SBOM for all of our software. So I can now look at the LabVIEW code, and I can see all of those components that we use. And so if another Log4j came out with just a quick look, we can see which products are using Log4j. And that's really great for us as a vendor so that we can keep up to date on those components. We're trying to get to the point where we can share that to you, right? So that now you are using LabVIEW and this Log4j thing comes out and you can look and say, does that affect me in the product I bought from NI? And we're not quite there yet. We will be in the next year or two. We'll be able to share those broadly with everybody.
I was gonna say it seems like that regulation is coming at some point.
Right now it's a proposed regulation for any software you sell to government. It was proposed and it came out in like October of last year, and it was open for comment until February, and we're still waiting for the final thing to come out. But the proposed language said that any software you sell to government has to have an SBOM available. It doesn't say how you make it available. It has to be posted on the web or if it's available by request. It didn't clarify that, but it has to become available. So that's why we started tooling up, was to make sure we were ready for that. And we know that our customers, our LabVIEW developers, are going to need that too. And so we're trying to get to the point where we can share that.
Yeah. I wonder, just off the top of my head, if that also, I mean, I realize it's necessary, but I wonder if that also makes the bad guy's job a little bit easier because they're like, oh, this thing has a vulnerability. Can I go find applications that use this? Oh, and now I can somehow
Yeah,
cross-reference that and put that in a database and figure that out.
that's probably the largest reason why we haven't shared ours. Just put it on the web, because we know that we just start publishing it on the web, like we're just advertising, making ourselves a target, making our customers a target. So that's one huge concern that we have. The other main concern that we have is that this is the first time we've created this catalog, and we're seeing for the first time some of these components. And so as we're indexing that against the known databases of vulnerabilities, we're finding that, wow, there's a lot of old components that we haven't looked at for 10 or 15 years inside of LabVIEW that we
Ooh.
need to go update. And before we expose that to everybody, let's spend a little bit of time kind of updating those components, and then we'll give that to you next year. And when we release it, I don't think we're going to be at the point where we have zero vulnerabilities, not for 3 years, because that's the CRA deadline. But we'll have those kind of minimized to where we can explain away, like, there's this vulnerability, but it's not exploitable, or this is why we haven't updated this component yet. But we're trying to get to that point where we feel comfortable enough with what's in there that we can share that to everybody, and we share that through a mechanism that doesn't create a roadmap for any potential hackers.
Yeah, make it a little bit harder for them.
Yeah, yeah, a little bit harder. It's got to be. Don't want to make it easier. So it's interesting. Over the years, we haven't had a lot of like actual hacks on LabVIEW or reports of vulnerabilities in LabVIEW. So 2 or 3 years ago, we were getting 2 or 3 reported security vulnerabilities per year where people were like, hey, we noticed that with CVI, if you do this thing, you can hack into CVI. We had very little of that over the years. This past year, we've had a steep increase in the number of those reported vulnerabilities to us, where people are taking our product and noticing vulnerabilities in our products. And it's usually related to a component that we're using, but where they're reporting and saying LabVIEW has this vulnerability. And I think it's because we've kind of come on the radar of a few white hat hackers. These guys who's make it their job to go and find some software and report vulnerabilities around it. And as they found LabVIEW, so we kind of have been under the radar for a long time, but now they found LabVIEW and they realized that they can find a bunch of stuff in there. So they've been finding it and reporting it to us. And so we went from 2 or 3 a few years ago to, still less than 20, I think, over the last year, but a bunch of these reports. And some of those reports we get and we're like, that's really obscure. None of our LabVIEW users ever would or could do that. But we can see that there's some activity of people trying to figure out how to get into our product.
I'm curious, has NI ever thought about doing some sort of bug bounty program? Do they have one?
We've done that a couple times over the years with new things, with bugs. I don't remember what the version was. Was that LabVIEW 5 or 6 or 7? We did one of those bug programs. But right now, no, and mainly because by running that SBOM, for example, we have a pretty good idea of what we need to do. We just need the resources to do it. So we're not at the point yet where we have so few bugs that we need help finding the bugs. What we really need is figure out how to fix the bugs faster.
Okay. Cool.
Have you noticed that the speed of adding new features has slowed down? That every new change in your code seems to introduce new bugs? Did your boss hand you a mess of spaghetti and then ask for new features? Have we got the workshop for you? SAS Workshops has a brand new course available called Refactoring. In this workshop, we'll cover techniques on figuring out what to tackle first, safe refactoring, testing techniques, and we'll have lots of hands-on exercises. Our next offering of our refactoring workshop is February 27th and 28th, 2025. Find the link to register in the show notes.
You mentioned the IT department and working with them. Do you have any advice on dealing with difficult organizations?
That's funny. Those are two different questions, right? Working with IT or working with difficult organizations, or is that the same question?
Possibly. I guess it depends on your IT department.
Yeah. So I've in my role, I have to work a lot with IT because we've had to set up a because NI has always been a global organization, and so our email servers are outside the U.S. and we have a lot of employees around the world. And if you email me something on our system, my employees in Hungary can see it. My admins down in Costa Rica can see it, and so it's not really a closed off U.S. based system. So we've had to build a US based system in order to handle some US contract work that we're doing. And so I've been kind of leading that effort and creating a system where we use a government cloud. We call it our Gov Cloud. It uses technology from Microsoft where the server is a more secure server and the software is a more secure version of the software, and we pay a heck of a lot more for it. And we just have a couple hundred of our employees that use that for their email server rather than using the other Emerson one, or NI now Emerson one. And so in setting that up, I've had to work a lot with IT, and it's been a very frustrating journey along the way, because at times I go to them and, like you said, they're the no organization, where I go in and I'm like, hey, we just need this thing, and it's gonna help us with win these contracts. And their answer is, well, no, we're busy with other stuff, and I don't know all the other stuff that they're doing, and that makes it frustrating to me because clearly what I need is important. And so what I've found in trying to work with those people is that, again, they don't know what I do. Just like I said, with the LabVIEW test systems, they have no idea. So as I've started my engagement with them, giving them context and helping them understand what we do in general, so that they can see the business, they can see all of that. They find that to be very fascinating, because most of them have their heads buried on a laptop all day long, and they don't get to see what the company actually does. So most of my IT team, they've never seen LabVIEW. And they don't know how cool and exciting it can be to develop LabVIEW stuff, but they're all software developers because they're in IT. So I've done some LabVIEW demos for the IT team just to kind of show them, this is the kind of product we sell. This is what we're talking about, and that builds some rapport with me, and having that relationship helps a lot. If I had a lab with a shaker table and a destructive test, I'd grab some IT guys and I'd bring them out there and show them, come see my test, come see this tester that we're building. You can see how cool this is, and that gives them a story that they can tell their kids when they go home, and they can get pretty excited about that stuff. But more importantly, it builds that personal relationship with you. So when you go back to them and you're like, hey, I need this thing, and they tell you no, you feel more comfortable asking them, how do I get you to say yes on this? Right?
Yeah. Well, I think you hit on something too, in that it's a matter of priorities, and oftentimes IT departments are overworked.
Yeah.
And your request is important to you, but in the grand
Yeah.
scheme of things they're doing, where does it fit? And I don't know. Sometimes maybe you need to go over their head, or you need to figure out, go to whoever's in charge and be like, hey, look, here's what I got to do. How can we balance that out with all the other priorities so that it makes sense?
And the way that you have to do that is based on some kind of metric, right? And so for us, as the kind of company we are, it all comes down to how much revenue is it going to generate. And so if I just go in and start, banging on their door telling them this is really important to me, that, it might be, but if they can just get me to go away, it's not important to them. But if I can go in and show them a dollar amount, even if it's just an estimate on my side, if I can show them, these customers need this, and those customers represent this amount of money, that really does help me to get through that prioritization, because they'll either have a number that they can compare to other projects, or those other projects don't have numbers and mine does, and so it makes it a lot easier to prioritize mine above what they do.
Yeah.
And so it's an extra little bit of work that I have to do, but having that number in my head or on a slide as I go in to pitch my idea and say, this is worth this much money, it really helps me to help to get them to prioritize things correctly.
Yeah, I think along with that too, just understanding incentives too. Like, what are they incentivized to do? Are they incentivized by
Yeah.
how quickly they close tickets? Are they incentivized by how many tickets they close? Are they incentivized by, some other metric?
Yeah, for sure. Understanding what their incentives are, that's a really great point. I mean, generally for relationships, that's a good point. But with the IT teams and those groups that are hard to work with, where you're asked, usually they're hard to work with only because you have to ask them to do something, right? If you don't
Yeah.
have to ask them to do anything, then they're great to work with. But yeah, when you go in and ask a group to do something for you and they're resource constrained, it's sometimes just easier to tell you no than to tell somebody else no because they have to tell somebody no. And you can be really rude and try to make yourself um, just argue and yell, but still it's easier to hang up on you than it is to tell somebody else no. But if you've got a relationship and they know that you're in it for the long haul and that what you're doing is valuable, then it becomes really hard to tell you no because they can't just hang up on you. If they hang up on you, you still have a relationship, you still have the dollar amount,
Yeah.
and that makes it important.
Yeah, yeah, and it also stands out too because lots of people don't bother with that relationship side either. And so,
Yeah, yeah.
so you brought up Emerson. How have things changed in the security side since the move to Emerson? Has that put more emphasis on security or about the same?
Yeah, so the whole Emerson move has been really interesting. It's been a just over a year now. It was a year in October. And when they bought us, the internal talk was that they didn't want to buy us to make us Emerson. They wanted to buy us so that they could learn from the NI culture and the NI technologies. And we all went, yeah, sure. That's what you tell everybody when you take over. Um, but the first good sign that things were going to actually be that way was when they put Ritu in charge of the NI company. Ritu was an NI person, not an Emerson person. So that was a pretty good indication that they wanted things to keep working the NI way. They've enforced some different rules on her for corporate oversight and goals, the way we kind of are accountable. Those things have become the Emerson way of doing that. But by and large, the things that we do are really the Emerson way of doing things. Um, and so what I'm finding is like for the security thing is there's a centralized team inside of Emerson, and Emerson has acquired, I think, 38 companies now. So that central group is just trying to exert influence over all 38 companies, but they can't control 38 different companies. And so each of the 38 companies has their own way of doing some stuff. So security is a good example of that. As we look at that central group for security, they have a specific set of security requirements that Emerson has always kind of centralized and pushed, which is 62443. And I've looked at that set of security requirements, and they're really good, but they're very focused on control systems. So as a PLC company, they make total sense.
Hmm.
But most of those controls make zero sense for LabVIEW because LabVIEW is it's not really a control system. And so if we just adhere to those controls, we'll be overly secure in some ways and under secure in other ways. So so we've engaged with that group to tell them, look, we like 62443. It's nice, but it may apply to some of our products, but that is not going to be how we dictate our products. For us, things like NIST 800-171, that's a better set of requirements. And so we've educated them on that, and then we've looked for and created mapping documents to show how does our document map to their document and our requirements to their requirements. So we're educating each other, but they're not forcing us to follow their procedure. But we are getting some good, like their legal team is really good. So when we've had questions, they've, because they're that much bigger of an organization, they've been able to come back and educate us on some really important things around security and trade compliance and things.
Well, you just brought up a very important point that I don't think gets emphasized enough is that security is somewhat contextual in the sense that I saw
Mhm.
an example where, okay, if you have two users on a system and one user can see the other's phone number, is that a bug? Is that a security thing? And it really depends on the context, right? If it's a dating app, maybe that's a big deal. If it's
Yeah,
your internal office network thing where you're trying to get a hold of your boss, maybe you want them to be able to see the phone number and the information,
that's
right?
right.
So like the context is different. It's the same information.
Yeah.
One is a security hole, one's not. So,
Yeah, and that comes up a lot with data systems because as we're collecting data, and most IT requirements are written for like information, and they're thinking of like social security numbers and passwords and those kinds of things. And we're thinking of, test data coming off of this widget that we're collecting. And if you treat those both as the same kind of data, you get into lots of problems, right? It's easy to encrypt a social security number. It's really hard to encrypt a big set of data
several
coming off of a
gigabytes of
streaming
data.
device.
Yeah.
And so it just doesn't make sense. And so you need to understand the context so that you can apply the right set of regulations and rules to that.
Yeah. Yeah, and then it goes into too, like a lot of it's like threat modeling and what is the threat and what are you afraid of people actually being able to do?
Yeah,
And, like, you know, is your threat like somebody trying to sabotage your stuff? Is it a competitor trying to steal your trade secrets? Those are like two different kind of models, I think.
absolutely. Right. And it's not always easy to tell. A couple of years ago when the war between Russia and the Ukraine broke out and Germany came out in support of that, um, I know that there were some companies or in Germany that were hacked by these professional, Russian-backed, like government-backed Russian organizations, and they hacked in and they targeted some of their personnel files and things like that, because that could really damage the company that they were hitting, and that's but those same hackers could go after like a gas line or something like that, right? Um, just Yeah, and so understanding the value of the data that you have and the different ways that you can get into that system and doing that threat profiling, it's really important. But um, I don't know if we can ever predict all the different ways and all the different people are going to be trying to hack into our systems.
Yeah, yeah. That is yeah, you just kind of have to pick like this one's most likely, so that's what we'll protect against and
And
like
continue to update. And this is actually, I think, one of the biggest problems, that in this shift over the last few years, because we've all worked on systems where, especially DoD systems, are funded primarily upfront with very little money for ongoing updates and continuous improvement, right?
Mhm.
So the problem with that is that, if any of us work in an organization, I mean, my computer every week gets a mandatory update from my IT department. And that's a really important part of security, is to have that system to be updated, because there are continuously discovered hacks coming out and different ways to attack my system. Well, the way that DoD funds a lot of their projects is, we're going to freeze this in time, and I want this system to work for 20 years with no additional funding, with no additional updates. Well, how in the world are you going to keep that system secure for 20 years as new hacks and new things come out? So it's got to evolve. But the only way that it can evolve is if the funding model from the DoD changes from the current all up front to where they are continuously funding security updates to keep that system secure, which may require at times, right, that revalidation of the system, because some of those security updates are going to be significant enough that it's going to change the security profile of that device.
So, a couple questions around that occur to me. One, are you seeing the government put more funding behind that, or is that still something they?
No.
Okay.
And I actually go to quite a few security conferences, and I bring this up because they'll still, I'll see the experts stand up in front of in a panel, and they'll talk about, continuous updates is a fundamental part of it. And I'll raise my hand and ask, well, what about this problem? You say that, but the funding does not match what you're saying. And they kind of look at each other and go, oh, yeah, that kind of is a problem, but it's bigger than us. And so I have not, again, I'm not talking to generals or anything, right? But that problem is a real problem that's not being addressed in the way the DoD operates today.
That's interesting. And then the other question that occurred to me on that, would continuous updates then mean like upgrading LabVIEW versions over time? And then how does that play with the hardware compatibility? Because, I inherit lots of projects, and generally, if I can, I try to upgrade the LabVIEW version. But one of the things that sometimes holds me back is hardware compatibility stuff. Isn't I looking to extend that in any way, or have they thought about that?
Yeah, so this is it's a big topic of conversation that we have with the R&D teams a lot right now, because, um, as you know, we have, like support models, right? So we'll say we have a version of LabVIEW and we support it for 3 years or whatever it is.
Mhm.
Um, well, that's a really simple way of saying that we support it. What does it mean to support it? Well, it means when we have we'll keep adding new features and stuff to it over time, I guess. But then what happens about security? And because a lot of the time customers want support, but they don't want new features added to a version of LabVIEW. They just want to know that it's going to stay secure. But then for that kind of update, maybe 3 years is not long enough, right? Um, but according to NIST 800-171, if you have a system that is not getting security updates, you need to either update it or turn it off. You can't be operating a system that has any software component that's not getting updated. And so we have to figure out, what does that mean for us? Does that mean that we're going to continue to apply updates longer for an older version of LabVIEW, security updates only, right? Does that mean we're going to keep doing that? Or does that mean that we are going to force our customers to update their LabVIEW version? And if we do, what if they are using an older version of hardware? And then we run into those incompatibility issues. So that's causing us a lot of worry and stress right now as we're trying to figure out, what does the future of secure LabVIEW look like? So
One
we're trying to figure
suggestion
that out.
that I've made, and I don't know if you've thought of this or not, I'm sure somebody at NI probably thought of it too, is a lot of Linux versions have a long-term support version.
Mhm.
Like, this version is going to be supported for a long time, and all the versions in between them, they are supported for a much shorter time, and they're just adding features. But the long-term
Yeah.
support version doesn't really get any features. It just gets bug fixes and security patches. And I
Windows
think,
does that too.
yeah.
Yeah, so there's,
Oh,
there's a long-term support of Windows, and actually we just updated our PXI controller, so you can buy the long-term support version of Windows for a PXI controller.
I didn't know that, but yes, that's good.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and
I
so
mean,
and that's actually I think the hard thing for LabVIEW, and this is and I we've talked about this idea, and I'm kind of pushing it, is to say, let's come out with a version and say this version is going to be our long-term support version of LabVIEW. So if you have a long-term version, then stick on 2024 Q3, like that's the version we're going to support the longest out of for the next few years.
mhm.
And so we're still looking at if that's going to work or not, but we need something like that. The problem with that is, um, what happens when we keep updating, keep updating, keep updating, but then we tell people we're going to support it for 10 years, but in 5 years there's some update to underlying Windows or one of the components that completely breaks that, and we don't have a way to update that. Then what? So it's a real challenge for us, and the fact that LabVIEW is made up of, like I said, thousands of components that we've used from everywhere. And as you evolve those and keep updating those, at some point it becomes a different version, right? So, a few years ago, LabVIEW had a particular version of OpenSSL, and that OpenSSL version component had some vulnerabilities to it. So we've had to update that. Now, when we make that update, does that make it a new version? Or we can say it's an old version, but it's really a significant update that probably needs to be revalidated anyway. So it's a really hard problem to solve. It's not as easy as just saying, well, just support LabVIEW for longer. But
So
um,
I guess Linux has less of those issues, maybe because the hardware is not necessarily changing out from under it. Like if it's installed on a
yeah,
specific PC, it's staying on that PC, whereas you're installed on top of Windows, which is shifting. Is that my understanding that correctly?
I
Maybe.
I guess I don't know why it's maybe we use like that's I'm sure that's not the case. Linux has got to use more components than we use because Linux is all open source components.
I don't know. Yeah, I guess maybe like the old long-term support version of Linux doesn't have to support the new hardware though, right? I mean, it
Yeah.
could still be the LTS version and just be like, hey, this LTS version doesn't support this hardware. Wait for the next LTS version or something.
But that would probably be the case with LabVIEW too, right? So if we froze, like if you were using LabVIEW 2014 today, because we had frozen it for 10 years,
Yeah.
and we just said it doesn't support any of the newer hardware that came out, that's probably okay because you're probably not adding that new hardware to those old test sets from 10 years ago.
Yeah. Until you go to buy one of those old computers and can't find them, but that's a whole other issue.
Yeah,
That's that having
yeah.
spares and stuff. So
So there's a lot of conversation going on at NI about how we improve our long-term support.
cool. Okay, one last thing. I like to ask people a question of can you tell me about an experiment that you've tried and that didn't turn out the way you thought it would, and what did you learn?
Ah, That's a funny question because I'm not really a lab guy. Like I'm not an actual engineer. I just play one on TV. I've only been in sales and marketing my whole career. But in school I was a physics major. So when I came out of school and had my kids, and they were they were going to school, the elementary school was looking for their science fair. And so I was on this little board of parents. We were trying to figure out how to make the science fair. And we were talking about maybe hiring somebody to come in and do these science experiments, a little science show. And I said, we don't need to hire anybody. I can do that. So for about 5 or 6 years, I got roped into being the science guy at my kids' elementary school. And it was actually a lot of fun. And part of what I would do is I'd go buy some liquid nitrogen, and we'd do frozen liquid nitrogen and stuff. But for those few years, I was always looking for like the next cool demo that I could use. And I went to the Children's Museum one day, and I saw the coolest experiment that I wanted to use as my grand finale. And what they did was they took a pop bottle, a plastic 2-liter bottle, and they put some dry ice in it, and then they put some water in it, and they put the lid on it. Now, if you've ever done that, it's called the dry ice bomb, and it's really dangerous. So kids don't do this at home. Um, uh, and if you take that out, it'll blow up pretty good because it expands the pressure to the point where the bottle just can't take it anymore, and it explodes rather violently. And I'm like, I want to do that, but I don't want to kill any kids in the process. So how are we going to do this? Well, what they did at the Children's Museum was they put that in a big oil drum, filled it with water, and then they took that bottle and tied a rock to it so it sank, and then they all stepped back. And when it exploded, all it did was push this column of water out of the oil drum. And I was like, that is so cool. Okay, so that's going to be my experiment. My problem was that I didn't actually have any like on hand liquid or any dry ice, but I have my liquid hydrogen, which does the same thing. It's not any more powerful because it's colder. It's just it's just the way it is because it blows up when the bottle blows up. And but I didn't have an oil drum. I don't know how to get an oil drum, so I went down to my local store and I bought a 25-gallon garbage can, a plastic garbage can. And I took that and put that in with all my stuff. And I thought, I should practice this once before I go down to the actual show in front of a bunch of kids and do this. And so I put it in my backyard and I filled it up with water, and I took a bottle and I put some liquid nitrogen in it, and I put the water and I put the cap on with the rock and I dropped it in, and I had my kids and I said, okay, let's go back. And we went back quite a ways. So I didn't know what was going to happen. So hopefully we were going to be safe, right? So we ran back and we're watching, and it's not like you have a fuse. So I don't know when it's going to blow up. We're just kind of watching and watching. And then boom, we heard this big boom. But I didn't see a column of water. I just saw all of a sudden this water-shaped garbage can shaped water column appear and then just fall down. And what happened was the garbage can did not hold it at all, and the garbage can completely blew into little pieces of shred. And I didn't find a piece bigger than my finger anywhere in my backyard. Like it had just completely blown that garbage can all over the place. And so, man, I was sure glad I didn't do that at the finale. So I ended up doing like a Diet Coke and Mentos thing that night instead. But that would have been quite the experiment if I'd blown up half of the front row.
Yeah, that would be pretty crazy. Luckily, hopefully the plastic wouldn't have done too much damage. I don't know.
Yeah, it came out of there pretty violently. But
yeah, I guess that's I'm always after people to try to experiment, but one of the keys is like that, to try to experiment in a safe place where if it doesn't work, nobody dies, nothing irreparable happens, hopefully.
Exactly.
So, yeah, that's a good lesson. So,
yep.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Steve.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure. Good to talk to you, Sam.
Thanks. That's it for today's episode of the LabVIEW Experiment. Thanks for listening. If you have any comments or questions, head over to thelabviewexperiment.com and drop me a note. And don't forget to subscribe to the podcast and follow us on Twitter and Instagram @TheLVExperiment.